Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who is with us. This, I think, probably is the most international in terms of its technology of any of the events that we've organized so far simultaneously. We've got speakers joining us from all over the world, and Hani is in London, for example, and I'm in Vienna. Howard's in Australia. Lissant, I think, is in London, and so on. But anyway, so it's wonderful to see everybody, and thank you for organizing everything, Hani. Just a couple of little remarks from me. The first one is actually about the film festival, which you saw advertised. Our film officers are doing a splendid job in putting together a multiple event. So please do take a careful look at that, because it's not the same as normal. What they're doing is they're organizing a month-long virtual screening of all the films that are being shown. So people will be able to join in the film screenings and indeed the associated conference which goes with it from anywhere in the world. But additionally, just to make it clear, there will be a face-to-face conference taking place at the Watershed in Bristol. And anybody who buys a ticket to the two virtual events can also come along free of charge to the Bristol face-to-face event. We really are trying something new here, and congratulations to them for trying it, and we hope that it goes very well. And the other remark I'd just like to make is what a great joy it is to be able to be with everybody today from my point of view. One of the greatest transitions which has taken place in anthropology since I started in the 1980s is that as every decade passes, the place of museums in the wider academic discipline of anthropology is becoming clearer and clearer and clearer as being one of holding the utmost importance. So the conventional idea of the 1980s, obviously false, that museums were just fuddy-duddy places where occasionally one could shelter out of the rain, has shown now to be utterly falsified. And of course, the person and the people who have done so much to falsify that idea are with us today. It really is wonderful that we can now catch up and reflect upon this transition together at the same time as marking this extraordinarily important work that helps us understand that transition better. Well, that's all from me, except please don't forget to file your questions in so we have a wonderful discussion, and as many of them possible also we'll try and take live. I'm going to pass over now to Prof. Basu, until recently a chair of anthropology in SOAS, but now reincarnated, as it were, in a different role, which I'm sure he can talk about if he wants to. And then Howard is going to turn over to the editors. So thank you very much, and over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, David, and thank you to the editors and the contributors of this book for the invitation to be part of this this launch. It's a great privilege, and I'd like to congratulate them all for producing such a significant collective work. So I'm going to give a little kind of response to the book, about 15 minutes or so, and then I'll of course hand over to Howard and to Robyn, the editors, who will then no doubt give us a lot more insight, as it were. But I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. So let me go into the kind of response that I've formulated as I've read. So as David's already alluded to, ethnographic collections continue to be important spaces for thinking about and discussing cultural differences, including differing value systems, of course. And they've become key sites for addressing histories of colonialism and the continuing legacies of those histories today. As we know, the discipline of anthropology is thoroughly entangled in this context. Many of the collections discussed in this book date to a period when the museum was a primary site for anthropological research and theory making. And while the ethnographic museum has long been pushed to the periphery of mainstream social anthropology, this book demonstrates how these museums and these collections remain highly relevant, not only as sites for confronting anthropology's difficult histories, but as venues and catalysts for contemporary cross-cultural engagement and understanding. This is reflected in familiar tropes such as James Clifford's application of Mary Louise Pratt's concept of the colonial contact zone to the museum, a notion that's nuanced by different contributors to the book, using vocabularies such as the shared room or a middle space. And an alternative conceptualization to this is put forward by Raymond Silverman in the notion of the museum as process. Silverman calls attention to the fundamentally processual nature of museums' collaborative work with communities, and draws attention to the, quote, potential of museums as spaces in which diverse intellectual, professional, and cultural communities meet and engage in work that yields new ways of thinking, new ways of living, end of quote. And I think this attention to the work of the museum is, rather than the space, for instance, is key. Museums have also become sites of decolonial activism, and ethnographic collections have become, as Lissant Bolton puts it in her chapter, emblems of colonialism and branded wholesale as colonial loot. This book provides a corrective to this misconception and demonstrates powerfully the importance of adopting an ethnographic approach to understanding the ethnographic museum, and particularly to understanding the museum as it's recast here as process rather than edifice. Of course, we should also understand museum activism ethnographically too, attending to who, for example, is making what claim and what relationship they have to the communities whose materials are at the centre of the debates. The contributors to this volume have in common often career-long engagements in the transcultural work of museums as anthropologists, as curators, and as Indigenous cultural practitioners. From their different but often overlapping and intersectional positionalities, they share a commitment to the value of the museum itself, alive to its possibilities. What sets the volume apart from others in the field in particular is its focus on how museums participate in the creation of value. It is significant that the editors do not present an exhaustive definition of value in their introduction. Rather, they rather wisely leave it to the contributors to elaborate on the different regimes of value, value creation, and value transformation in the particular contexts they discuss. Few would disagree with Lissant Bolton when she writes that the value of an object is elusive. She describes the significance and value of an object as a kaleidoscope of possibilities. And this is a powerful metaphor, capturing something of the constantly shifting patterns of meaning and value associated with things, and how these are also deeply perspectival, dependent on constellations of possibilities that cannot be reduced to Western versus Indigenous or museum versus source community, but shift between multiple categories of identity and identification. While activists have accused anthropologists and museum curators of deploying complexity as a delaying tactic, for example, endlessly prevaricating over the repatriation of collections, the book's editors and contributors defend the need for a slow museology, deferring to Indigenous actors' own hesitancy in these matters, which arise from their insight into local complexities that even the anthropologist's forensic understanding of cultural and historical context fails to grasp. From Malinowski to Mauss, the concept of value and the plurality of forms of value have been a dominant theme in anthropology and anthropological studies of material culture in particular. Kopitov's notion of the cultural biography of things has been especially influential in contemporary material culture studies. The contributors in this volume seek, however, to go beyond this notion of the object biography with its characterization of the different life phases of an object as it moves through a succession of regimes of value. What typifies the case studies in this book is not succession, but simultaneity, that objects, including objects in museums, simultaneously exist in and are constituted by multiple value systems, which may or may not be in tension with one another. A glance in the book's index gives us a quick indication of the breadth of these systems. The essays thus call us to reflect upon affective value, the value of authenticity, ceremonial value, documentation as enhancing value, evidentiary value, exchange value, hierarchies of value, monetary value, the role of provenance research and the creation of value, religious value, scientific value, social value, the transience of value. And of course, each of these categories does a violence of its own. For example, when documentation is found to be unreliable, unsettling the evidentiary value of a photograph as explored by Chris Morton, or when categories such as sacred are conceptualized by stakeholders in quite incompatible ways, as discussed by James Gibson. If the museum provides a space for such diverse regimes of value to converge and coexist, we must acknowledge that this shared room may also be a space of incongruity. Three final quick thoughts in defense of the museum. The first, mentioned by Howard Morphy and Robyn McKenzie in their introduction, relates to the technology of the museum and the anticipation of the future value of collections. While the motivation for assembling ethnographic collections discussed in the book undoubtedly reflects the value of the time in which they were collected, collections also constitute resources for futures unimagined at the time of collection. The very idea of collecting for posterity anticipates this unimaginable future, and this is surely one of the great values of museums and archives. This leads to a second point raised explicitly in Ween's chapter, but implicit in most contributions, and that is to acknowledge that the unimagined future of our present time is one in which the hierarchies of value, which for so long have ordered disciplinary museums, and which appeared at the time to be unquestionable truths, have been well and truly destabilized. This is reflected powerfully in the volume, but the consequences of this for institutions which are typically conservative in character is both challenging and liberating. While ethnographic museums are perceived as fusty, old-fashioned places, it could be argued that in embracing alternative epistemologies and ontological worlds, they are at the forefront of attempts to decolonize the academy. Few other spaces of the university, for instance, share this kind of openness. And my last point, a point made by Ween, points itself to a failure of the museum. The chapters of this volume provide ample demonstration that museums, and particularly anthropological museums, are dynamic, politically engaged, reflexive, creative spaces with sustained cross-cultural relationship building. The tragedy is that this work, the museum as process, often takes place behind the scenes and is invisible to the majority of museum visitors, who are instead confronted with a different conceptualization of the museum, a static institution, a building containing vitrines containing objects, perhaps anachronistic legacies of colonial ideologies. The challenge for the museum is surely to exhibit its process, including how it negotiates competing regimes of value and participates in the creation of value itself. So let me now hand over to Howard and Robyn to take us forward.
Well, can people hear me? Thank you very much indeed for that. It's wonderful to have someone giving a review of our book that actually seems that it was the book that we were engaged in producing. And I think your reference to museum as process really lies at the heart of the linking arguments. And I also really appreciated you referring to the index, because I believe in indexes. And Robyn and I spent a week producing that index. And the fact that you found the index valuable makes it absolutely worthwhile. my talk, first of all, I'd like to though begin by acknowledging that Robyn and I here are speaking from the unceded country of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the region of the Australian Capital Territory. And my talk is going to have a slightly personal element in that I'm holding in my hand one of my most valuable possessions, a spear thrower. It was given to me by the great Yolngu artist Narrachin Meimaru in 1976. We were camped on the beach at Gorkawoi, accompanying the filmmaker Ian Dunlop, who was making a film, at Dundiwai Wanambi's request, a film of the Dungwan ceremony. There was a port in the proceedings, and Narrachin, always working, decided to show me, I'll keep moving it around a little bit, how spear throwers were traditionally made. It's made from a piece of wood cut from the trunk of a native apple tree and planed into shape with a machete. The peg, here we can see, was bound in string and then sealed with resin. The resin had been harvested from the root of an ironwood tree the previous day by me under strict instructions from Narrachin. It's painted in manganese, the black, yellow ochre with red across the bindings. And yellow is the color of the Yiricha moiety, Narrachin's moiety. And Narrachin never used this as a spear thrower, but he did use it for the whole of the following week as a ceremonial walking stick and as a ceremonial spear. So it took different kinds of roles, but was never used in action against a kangaroo. You can see this in Dunlop's film Madapul Funeral at Gorkawoi. Now, in describing the spear thrower in this way, I've hinted at aspects of how the object is valued by me and valued by Narrachin and used by Narrachin. And I've been engaging in a cross-cultural value creation process with a diverse audience. On reflection, the odd thing is that there have not been dozens of books about museums and the creation of value, because museums have been central to that process in many ways. I think one reason is because value is too often thought about in terms of economic value, the value in monetary terms from the perspective of an auctioneer, or uncharitably that museums are full of loot. But value creation in a different sense lies at the heart of museums, and on the whole, making collections is not motivated by a desire to make money. Most curators of museums do not look at their collections primarily in terms of monetary value. The main focus of this book is on ethnographic collections. And in the introduction, we have used Henrietta Litch's and Nicole Hartwell's succinct definition of ethnographic collections as comprising objects that are salient to the understanding of culture, of a culture. The test of a minimal definition is whether its core concept is transferable to other items in the same set, and it works quite well. A natural history collection is salient to the understanding of the natural world, a science museum to the understanding of scientific methods and discoveries, and in Litchi and Hartwell's case, salient to the history of British regimental museums and understanding that. Obviously, any minimal definition leaves a lot out. We might add that the entangled and changing relationships between different cultures over time have increasingly become an important focus of museums as forums of action. The great potential of museum collections, in particular ethnographic, archaeological, and historical collections, is to engage with the value creation processes in which that object is entangled with at the time of its making, thereby enabling people to understand and appreciate the values and ways of life of different societies and different epochs, and communicating those understandings to others. A task that is in many cases extremely challenging, in that we don't have the kind of documentation that I have in the case of Narrachin's spear thrower. So museums need to be seen as places where value is added to collections through research and engagement. Ethnographic objects provide a window into the relationships at the time of the collections were made between the collector and their societies, and the societies of those who made and used the objects. And in doing so, they will discover, in many cases, uncomfortable histories. The understanding and value of objects in collection has changed enormously over time. And in a lot of this, I'm repeating what Paul said. And museums have engaged in very different value creation processes. And those processes have changed how the object is seen and sometimes where it is housed. I mean, the idea that everybody talks about these museums created in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries and actually somehow remaining unchanged since that point of time, it's sheer nonsense. And many of the essays in this book show that fact very clearly. A major area of competition in recent decades has been whether Indigenous objects should be valued as works of art and hence should be placed in art museums or remain part of the broader frame of museums of anthropology, culture and society. To me, the spear thrower that I showed you clearly has properties of an artwork, but at the same time, it can be valued from many other perspectives. I value the spear thrower because it brings me close to narrative, brings back memories of someone who I admired and who taught me so much. It evokes feelings of warmth, but holding it can give me a sense of confidence. As a documented ethnographic object, it provides an entry point into understanding many aspects of Yolngu society and technology. The values associated with objects in collections are almost infinite, which brings the question of whose position we adopt, whose understanding, whose values. Many of the chapters in the book focus on the relationships between objects and what are often referred to as source communities, the present descendants of people who made objects or who have close relationships with them. We're at an important moment in time when those relationships are being worked through anew. And this process has radically changed many people's understanding of the value of museums and their collections. The chapters in this book deal with those issues in multiple ways. They reveal how colonial histories have a major impact on how museums and their collections are seen and how people engage with them in the present. The surprising things in many ways is how often those changes were anticipated, both by the collectors and the original makers. Those involved in many cases did have futures in mind, a time when collections would have beneficial places in the lives of the generations who followed them. And indeed, to bring back to monetary value, how they were involved in relationships of trade and exchange very often. In conclusion, I'd like to thank Paul, obviously, enormously for speaking on the book. Our co-authors who have taken this journey with us patiently. The book's the outcome of 4 years or more collaborative engagement, during which we've received considerable support from the Australian National University and also from our colleagues at the new National Museum of Australia and the British Museum. That's my, over to Robyn now, I think.
Okay. Thanks, Howard. And yes, to reiterate, thanks again, Paul, for your response to the book and to the contributors also for their efforts. I was going to give my a small précis of my chapter as an example of something that was in the book for those of you that are coming to this from outside. So my paper looks at the different values attributed to the one collection over time, approximate lifetime, in fact, some 70 years, from when the collection was made in 1948 to now. The movement of the collection into and out of different regimes of value, as they've been termed, is common to many of the stories told in this collection, in this book. But the image I have in my mind is of more of an ocean swell, the collection moving up and down like some flotsam on the surface of that swell. A swell made up of circumstance as well as historical change, of individual motivations as well as collective group understandings, of connections made, memories engaged, and energies activated. The collection that, and I will now share my screen. So the collection I talk about comprises 192 mounted string figures from the Aboriginal community of Yirrkala in Northeast Arnhem Land. And it was made by the Australian museum anthropologist, Frederick McCarthy, while he was up there on an expedition. Anthropologists collected string figures, that is patterns that are made on the hands with a piece of string, from First Nations peoples in the later 19th century up until the mid-20th century. After the British anthropologist E.B. Tyler had floated the idea that a comparative study of these designs might be of value as a way of tracking cultural diffusion. McCarthy went to the field to make such a collection. The idea was formed before he went. He took with him industrially produced string and the card for mounting the figures. His focus was on collecting as many designs as possible. And you see that in his diaries. He found, when he went, his co-worker and collaborator, Nguruwe Munungur, who was a phenomenal string figure talent, and he worked singularly with her. She could make them fast for photographing, slowly for recording instructions, an important part of the collecting process. So in the final product of this activity was his report in the records of the expedition, which included a catalogue of all of the figures with instructions for making. As I said, his concern with number, with an acquisitive focus, is evident in his diary. The 4th of September it is. I continued working with Nguruwe and got the total of string figures to 173. 5th of September, in the evening, I worked with Nguruwe and took the total to 183. 7th of September, the total now is 190. There are probably more to be got here, and I shall try to get 10 more to make the 200, should time permit. McCarthy rated the collection as one of his most important achievements on the expedition, the most complete study of string figures yet made in one area in Australia, and by his estimate, 1/5 of all known string figures in the world at the time. However, when this report was published in 1964, some years later, the diffusionist project, and with it the relevance of a study like this, had passed. The American anthropologist Joseph Birdsell, in his review, dismissed it as the work of an earlier era. To quote him, one of the bric-a-brac figures in the cabinet of anthropology. And the string figures themselves, the mounted figures, were actually lost in the museum, unregistered in 2 dusty boxes. They were found under the stairs in 1988. So the first major thing that happened in the changing fortunes of this collection was that it happened to be found by curator Stan Florek and then was subsequently treated by museum methodology. The string figures were accessioned into the collection, treated by conservation, which included being mounted in double-sided frames in these box sets. Florek documented the collection and published a catalogue of figures and what was known of the context. And this made the collection available for access and research. So an obvious thing to do when I came along in 2008, interested in this collection and wanting to study it for a PhD, was to reconnect it with its source community. While the larger repertoire had faded from memory, a basic catalogue of figures and tricks still was being passed on in the Yirrkala community. And this is Dipilinga Bukalakchpi, making damala, or white-breasted sea eagle, which is that same design that Narol Mungal was making in 1948. But on the way there, Dippelinga made an interim figure there, Sea Eagle's Nest. And that's the figure that I want to focus on in the rest of this little story. I wanted something which would make this collection be of interest and engagement for members of the community apart from my project. And one of the things which we were most successful with was making a series of prints from the string figure designs. Yirrkala has a very established art centre with a printmaking studio. And for the Gama Festival of 2010, actually, not 2008, in the open air gallery, a series of 5 prints were exhibited, and along with them, the art centre made t-shirts with Dippelinga's Seagull's Nest design on it, which was seen around the festival ground. And this started a conversation. It started a wider remembering of the string figures and of their legacy. The string figure prints were picked up and shown in 2013, some years later, at the Museum of Contemporary Art. And so you see there the design has taken its way from Yirrkala, from the regional Gama Festival, right to the centre of art practice in the metropolis. And it also became something which was used as a logo in the redesign of the Art Centre's webpage in 2015. So from, in this way, the collection was in a series of incremental steps, which relied on both infrastructure and investment in the community, but also the individuals who were working in it to take the decisions that they took. From being of no value in a sense, in its middle years in 2017, the collection or part of it was installed on permanent display in the Australian Museum as one of its greatest things. So that's my little tale, which is a story which in various respects can be seen in other chapters where other factors come into play as well. So I'll hand over back to Howard now. Thanks.
Switch on your mic.
Hello. I hope you're all hearing me now. I just very briefly am going to be introducing the next 2 speakers before Robyn will then introduce the 2 after that. And literally very briefly, so we can keep things going. We're first of all going to hear from Ween, who is Professor in Social Anthropology and Cultural History at the Museum of Cultural History at the University of Oslo, and a very distinguished museum anthropologist, but who's also done fieldwork in Northern Australia on a slightly different set of topics, and when she did her doctorate at Oxford University. And she's going to be followed by Gwyneira, who also did her doctorate at Oxford University at the Pitt Rivers Museum, though, in this case, and in her case, focusing very much on museum anthropology, and in many ways has continued that relationship with First Nations communities in America, because she's now the curator of North American ethnology at the Smithsonian, but also very importantly, director of the Recovering Voices program, which they have, which is one of the really sort of major I suppose, ways in which anthropology museums are now beginning to use their resources to enhance and facilitate Indigenous people's engagement with those collections and the bodies of knowledge associated. So first of all, Gru.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen too, so I'll see if that works. I'll just show you some pretty pictures from the repatriation that I will speak to. Let's see.
Oh, yes. That worked.
No, it didn't, because it doesn't start with the beginning. There you go. All right, so good morning. My chapter in this collection is called Båstede, the emergence of value in the process of the Sami repatriation. And the repatriation that I speak to returned ownership of 2,000 objects between the years of 2012 and 2019, so it took quite a while. And it began with the ambition of two capital museums, the Cultural History Museum and the Norwegian Folk Museum, to return their Sami collections to 6 regional Sami museums. And the reason why only half of the collection was returned was because this was recommended by a working group with a Sami majority. And the image you see here is of a Sami costume, or a range of Sami costumes, gaktis, peering out of their storage at the Folk Museum. So from a Sami perspective, feelings towards the repatriation was always ambivalent, and it did in their eyes engage and respond to past colonial encounters, but at the same time, the repatriation exercise included what some felt to be ongoing colonialism, such as the conditions of unnegotiable conditions for return, or simply the act of having to ask for the objects back. The skills of the Sami representatives, often in majority in the commission meetings, in my opinion, created conditions that worked against what Sami scholar Lissant has described as the museum's ongoing acts of erasure. Writing about Båstede, I have been guided by Sami scholars, as I often do. And in the text, I follow the value making that takes place in the course of negotiations as storytelling practices. Here, Sami tradition of storytelling, myyhtälehti, involves acts of remembering, as well as acts of allowing others to share, but also contribute to collective memories. Although not a grand gesture, as other repatriation exercises might be, in my opinion, Båstede did have a reconciliatory potential, and that is significant in Norway these days because we do have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission going. During the long process, the meetings negotiated every artifact, producing a collective experience of sharing and contributing to and accumulating new joint knowledge. Sami representatives came to these meetings with lists of objects that they have hoped to have returned. And lists became a basic technology, revealing the many lives, the many qualities and values of an object. There were not just one list, but several, and each decision had rippling effects for the following priorities. The lists were compiled based upon consultations with local constituencies, as well as many forms of expertise held by Sami museum representatives, including knowledge of local material culture, traditional designs, family patterns, regional variations, local history, knowledge of significant families, local politics, significant events, but also the knowledge of material coming from the fact that many of the museum representatives also were skilled artisans or duyarat, such as knowledge of material, enabling us as a group to at least momentarily see with the eyes of a duyar, introducing a wide range of characteristics that often transformed the value of an object. This is a detail of a breastpiece of a gakti, a costume, female costume. Next to the actual return of the objects, the process of sharing the Capital Museum collections were productive, and maybe one could discuss what kind of gestures that enable restitution and reconciliation. Our commission meetings, relying on many forms of expertise, did arguably at least destabilize museum hierarchies. Such knowledge transfer could take place according to what Rana Kokkonen describes as the Sami ideal of lehi, of sharing, and within a setting where everyone learned and contributed according to their own qualifications. Knowledge, in other words, became the gift that released the return gift. And in such a dialogue, it is a gift to be introduced to other kinds of expertise or other epistemologies. Such a gift, according to Sami understandings, provides what Kokkonen calls a responsibility, a potential or indeed an opportunity to respond accordingly within what momentarily, hopefully, was a reciprocal, non-hegemonic relationship. As this text has described, stories told in these engagements with objects also revisited deeply meaningful events that many felt were concealed by provenance. As archives, these objects spoke to great loss, stories of religious oppression, discrimination and its consequences, the loss of traditional lands and subsistence practices, along with the effects of boarding schools, assimilation, discrimination, and shame. And this object was made by, as a miniature that also is a part of the collections at British Museum. And it's made by a man imprisoned after a famous rebellion in an effort to communicate Sami culture to the oppressive majority. And it's 150 years old. To end on a positive note, the last photo I have added is of a new Southern Sami museum, possibly at least enabled by the return. And it's opening this summer, and the artifacts are already on their way to be there for the opening. Thank you. That was my little story.
Thank you very much, Gru. And that was actually a wonderful, positive ending. And it's really good because one of the sort of key things is the provision of resources that are going to enable people to actually accommodate the material that is returned to them if they wish it to be returned. So that was a fantastic ending. And now it's over to Gwyneira Isaac in Washington, very early in the morning. I'm sorry, Gwyneira.
I'm going to have to speak quite quietly so I don't wake up the family. It's like five something in the morning. So thank you, Howard and Haneen and Jessica and everyone who's been part of organizing this event and participating in it. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some of the images. Okay, so thank you. Recently, one of the technicians from the Smithsonian Institution was adopted into a moiety of the Tlingit tribe of Alaska. This was done in order to create a digital 3D replica of a clan crest that the Tlingit could then animate through the process known as AU. Following this ceremony, the replicated clan crest now embodies the spirit of ancestors and unites them both within their living clan and with the ancestral beings. In effect, this digitally produced replica has been brought to life in a ceremony that affirms descendants' relationships with their ancestors. But this scenario has me asking, what do these kinds of digital 3D cultural heritage projects mean for museums, communities, and anthropology? And what are the values at play here? So the world around me is rapidly changing, technologically, socially, politically, and environmentally. And museum anthropology frameworks present analytical dynamics that focus often on separating out Anglo-European and Indigenous knowledge systems. And these methodological dynamics are becoming well-worn channels into which my analytical vehicles continually become stuck. So I gave myself the challenge of finding a liminal space within the creation process itself that would help me experience these environments in a novel way. So my starting point was to imagine myself as a 3D digital print and to ask who are my creators? What is my value? Do I have animacy? Who controls me? And who determines this? And how? So I should also explain that this particular way of thinking came out of an experimental graduate course that we taught across the Smithsonian. So this led to a new pathway that helped me bridge material culture theory with consumer research and introduce the idea of the moral object being. So to explain, anthropologists have looked at object animacy and anthropomorphism from emic and etic perspectives, largely focusing on indigenous belief systems. Alternatively, psychologists and consumer-based researchers have analyzed cognitive behaviors and responses to object beings from an intracultural and largely Western lens. In considering digital material culture theory and consumer research, I found a new entry point through which to understand these projects according to an intercultural framework around animacy and social obligations. For example, according to psychologists, when people give objects human-like qualities, they begin to treat them with moral values previously not awarded to inanimate ones. Consumer-based research also shows that companies manipulate people, unfortunately, and according to Epley, Waits, and Chiacopo, quote, marketers design anthropomorphic products and characters to elicit desired emotions from consumers, to convey specific social relations, and to increase sales, end quote. Of course, how you feel about Alexa or Siri as a friend or foe gives you a good idea about the success or failure of animacy as part of the manipulation of us as consumers. Nonetheless, companies use this idea of animacy to socialize people into desired kinds of behavior. For example, Chandler and Schwartz explained that, quote, Zipcars decided to name all of its rental vehicles and reported that this led to customers to be more diligent about cleaning and maintaining them, end quote. As a result, the anthropomorphized object acquires moral values previously not awarded to it as an inanimate object. Now let me introduce to you the digital 3D reproduction projects at the National Museum of Natural History here in Washington, D.C. To ensure against the loss of clan heritage, the clan leader and computer trainer for the state of Alaska, Edwell John Jr., who is shown here in the image, in collaboration with the museum, developed a plan to digitally replicate clan crests. These included the killer whale hat, which had previously been repatriated to the Daklawadi clan. Replication included laser scanning, photogrammetry, and close-up photography. Rather than using the well-known 3D printing process that builds objects by laying down fine layers of resin, this project employed a milling machine and a reductive process to carve the facsimile out of a block of wood. The resulting replica was painted and hand-cut abalone inlays were then added. The finished replica was subsequently presented to the Education Center here at the National Museum to help educate the public about Tlingit cultural values as well as repatriation processes, which, as people have just discussed, were not actually visible prior within the public spaces of the museum. It currently resides in an accessible glass case and has been brought out for the use of dance performances by the Tlingit. In an initial analysis of this project in 2014, it became clear that through this process and the project, the Tlingit assumed control of the replica and the digital files. As a result, the digitally reproduced replica embodies relationships of obligation between the tribe and the museum that often, and in many cases, were not awarded to the original object when it was in the museum. Interestingly, the museum and staff become part of the Tlingit networks of obligation. If we introduce into this the Anglo-American consumer research about the animated moral object, we can see how through the making of these digital 3D replicas, Tlingit and Anglo-American perspectives towards its treatment converge, creating an interculturally and morally informed digital object being. As a result, the Tlingit and Natural History Replica Project reconciles potentially problematic liminal intercultural space around issues of control and ancestral belongings, and attempts to prevent inappropriate use or treatment of these. So in other words, the digital replica, the negotiation around its creation requires very specific protocol, so that the secondary creation, the community has more control over how it is used within the museum. This results in the birth of a moral digital object being that formalizes treatment for both Tlingit and natural history staff within the intercultural context of the museum. So where does this lead us? If you're interested in further insight on the relationship between Alexa, zip cars, and digitally replicated Tlingit clan crests, as well as polyadic digital object beings, this presentation is just the teaser, and you will have to read the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gwyneira. And I think Robyn is now about to introduce our next two speakers.
We can't hear you right now, Robyn.
Yes, so our next two speakers, the first is Jason Gibson, who is currently a research fellow with the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization, but he's worked for the last 2 decades in repatriation, some of it with the Museum Victoria, but mainly concentrating in Central Australian area. And you need to look out for his forthcoming book, Repatriation of Indigenous Cultural Heritage, Experiences of Return in Central Australia. And then after him, Lissant Bolton, who is the keeper of the Departments of Africa, Oceania and the Americas at the British Museum and director of the Endangered Material Knowledge Program. Lissant was a member of the research team for the Relational Museum that produced the book, of which the book is a part. And she has been in her position for many years at the British Museum, while continuing to do work on her specialist area in Vanuatu, and particularly working in collaboration with the Cultural Centre there on the documentation and revival of women's knowledge and practices. So those are our next two speakers, and I will hand over to Jason. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I will share my screen also. Okay. Okay, so thanks everyone, and thanks particularly to Howard and Robyn for inviting me to include a chapter in this really impressive volume. I've really enjoyed diving into the contents of the book over the last few weeks. The subject of my chapter is the shifting values associated with Aboriginal sacred religious objects known as churunga or churinga, as it was written in the seminal works of Walter Baldwin Spencer and Francis Skillen in the late 1890s. The value and significance of these objects, as well as their associated songs, dances, and mythologies, continues to feature strongly in Central Australian Aboriginal community life. Only last week, for example, I was in the remote, I was in the remote community of Laramba, where I spent days documenting totemic designs and discussing how recently repatriated churunga from museums were being reintegrated back into people's lives. My chapter in this volume begins with a discussion of how these objects were historically collected and exhibited in museums. I then move on to show how these items have come to be one of the principal avenues now through which Central Australian Aboriginal communities interact with museums. Although present-day cultural restrictions don't allow the public viewing of these objects, Churanga can be broadly described as objects of stone or wood, often incised with totemic designs and adorned in red ochre. In this wonderful acrylic painting by the Unmudjara artist Clifford Possum, you can see two men depositing objects like this into a sacred storehouse. Normally disclosed to men following their initiation, these objects are regarded as embodying the essence of ancestral beings, and they're circulated in what I've described as a tightly controlled system of knowledge, access, and revelation. With the tumultuous social, cultural, and religious changes that followed after colonisation, however, Churanga came to accrue new values. The beauty of the incisions on the objects, as well as their exotic connotations, made them highly sought after objects for both private and public collectors. And although an early collector like Francis Gillen, who's pictured here with Aranda Men, stopped removing these objects after witnessing the deep distress that it caused people, the trade in these Churanga objects persisted, and there are now literally thousands of these items found in museums across the globe. Most, however, were acquired in ways that reveal a great deal about their shifting values. As discussed in this chapter and in my book, Ceremony Men, a particularly large collection of Churanga were collected by the ethnographer T.G.H. Strelo. Strelo's collection was assembled via deep engagements with numerous Aboriginal participants over many decades, and efforts to repatriate these items is now proving less than straightforward. The objects hold not just local religious value, but are regarded as representing significant interactions between a collector like Strelo and Aboriginal elders that use these opportunities to demonstrate their cultural expertise, their pride, their value, and their worth. In some cases, present-day elders see the value of keeping these collections in a single safe place, in a museum. In others, the ritual knowledge needed to control and care for these objects no longer exists. In other cases, the documentation associated with different Churanga is just so poor that present-day custodians can't really be ascertained. So Australian museums now defend the religious secrecy and mystery of these objects. They treat them not as type specimens, but as entities that are imbued with Aboriginal, but also national and historical cultural value. The special restricted storerooms that have been established in most Australian museums now to hold these objects tend to mimic the sacred cave and are accessible only to male museum staff and to initiated Aboriginal custodians. Moreover, museums regularly seek out dialogue with Aboriginal elders about repatriating such items. However, as I discussed in the chapter, the return of these spiritually charged items can spark great anxieties, and often negotiated solutions are required. These might involve further partnerships between museums and communities, and these are often sought out. So, for example, repatriated Churanga are now often relocated to a place called the Strelo Research Centre, a purpose-built facility to hold sacred materials like this in the heart of Central Australia, in the township of Alice Springs. So in this chapter, I can present Churanga as truly entangled objects. Indeed, as Howard and Robyn state in their preface to the book, or to this section of the book, these objects are valued for their role as containers of esoteric knowledge and spiritual power, both in the museum world and in the society of their custodians. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jason. That was great. And now, Lissant, it's your turn.
Thanks. So as I understood it, my role here was to kind of not so much talk about my own chapter in the book, which I could talk about, but whatever, but rather to sort of draw together some of the ideas in this seminar, and to give people a bit of a sense of some of the ways we might take it forward, because this is the beginning of thinking. This is just a stage in thinking about the process of objects and value. And I think what's really clear is that to everybody, value is so elusive that it can seem impossible to pin down. It's Robyn's ocean swell that she just mentioned. And really, that's because value exists in relationships. It can't be separated from the relationships in which it exists. And that's just been demonstrated this morning by Gwyneira talking about the relationship between the technicians making the replica and the clan, and the technician being adopted into the clan, or Jason's point about the relationship between Strello and the elders from whom he was making collections. If I may interpolate, everybody thinks about the museum as a sort of singular entity, but as anyone who's ever worked in a museum, or possibly even visited behind the scenes in a museum knows, a museum is an absolute hive of complex relationships, both personal and kind of scholarly in a way, as well as political and administrative. And I always remember that when I first started work at the Australian Museum in Sydney, I realised that the scientists, the ichthyologists and the conchologists and all those rather thought that the anthropology department was for people who really didn't know what they were doing and weren't scientific enough. And there was a whole hierarchy which left us at that time in the 80s somewhat at the bottom. And I always thought when I got to the British Museum that might be different. But of course, when I got to the British Museum, I was in a new hierarchy about classics and the sort of disciplinary hierarchy that involves. But I have to say, which has changed significantly over the years, and not least because of the engagement of source communities in collections and people suddenly realizing what resources and what importance collections had. So the changing value of the collections within the museum, as well as the changing value of the collections anywhere else, just demonstrates the extent to which value is really all about the relationships in which an object exists. And it's those relationships that invest the different range of different values. So you could say then that it's all so elusive, it's impossible, it's all so much process, as Paul pointed out, as to be impossible. But exactly no. If anthropology is about relationships, then why would it be any different for us? I think it's really important to be committed to knowing and understanding the processes and the sequences of value, both ethnographically, both in original contexts of making and using, and in more recent contexts in the museum and in the community. And also being alert to the way in which politics plays into that, and the ways in which people use the values of objects in prosecuting their own objectives of various kinds, some of which are very important and which one might, as I do indeed, strongly adhere to, but some of which you have to just understand are nonetheless political. So I think that this book and the presentations this morning just open up so many different important ideas, but they also open up, I think, the need for more of this kind of work, more of this kind of recognition. Maybe I would say that sometimes museums today almost step back from a recognition of some of the structures and politics that make value in order to accept the value. But in fact, it's a much more complicated process, and so one that we need to develop and continue. And I really thank Robyn and Howard for taking this book forward and making it happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's absolutely splendid. Thank you, everybody, for this really insightful introduction to a book which is obviously bursting with creative and important ideas. Now, this is the time colleagues, when you can fire in your questions into the Q&A box. So please don't hesitate to do that. We've a couple already, or more than a couple flowing in. Many quite specific to individual speakers. And so I just wanted to ask Howard a general one, sort of just to give us a bit of perspective here. So given now that you and your colleagues' work is demonstrating the extraordinary importance of museums again in such a scintillating way, can we assume, as it were, that the wheel has turned full circle and museums are now properly reincorporated into our anthropological programs, or is there still more work to do? How would you assess the present situation?
I think there's still an enormous amount more work to do. And partly, of course, we have to accept that anthropology is probably one of the most interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary disciplines that exist. So there are many, many anthropologists, not all of whom at the moment recognize the value of material evidence and collections to the work that they have. Interestingly, I think this is changing very much across the board, both in the areas of sort of biological anthropology, linguistic anthropology, ethnomusicology, as well as studies of material culture, art, and so on and so forth. And it's partly a result, indeed, of people's engagement with collections, with First Nations and source communities' engagement with them. And they're becoming very important. They're actually becoming central to forums where issues of the present can actually be discussed, hopefully and increasingly, in really quite sort of open ways over resources that can be used incredibly productively and much more productively than they have been in the past. I also think that the digital revolution that's happened has meant that access to material is suddenly being transformed. And there are a whole series of sort of ways in which suddenly anthropologists are able to access resources that open up research possibilities that previously they didn't realize. And I think because museums have been involved in, if you like, big data a lot more than most other areas of the subject, and have been linking historical with the contemporary for a long period of time. In many ways, museum anthropology is taking a lead and having a significant place in that. It's the sort of thing I could talk about for hours, but that's a start.
Well, thank you. That really is very, very helpful. Obviously, ideas for future events are coming into our mind, even as you talk so beautifully about this. Well, and now we have a whole stream of questions here. We have a question for Robyn at the beginning from Ilana Goldstein. Thank you for your question. And she says, with regard to your talk about string figures, of course, I praise you slightly. Could you please tell us a bit more about the community reactions concerning the museum collection and in relation to your own research?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I lobbed up in Yirrkala somewhat naively with this idea of connecting the community to this to this collection, which I'd only actually managed to photocopy the images of. So I was clumsy as well. And like any community, there were different responses to the collection. So some people just weren't interested. For some people, it was a children's game. For others, it was something more than that. And they, for example, started to talk to me about dancing with string figures and dancing with strings, which was a whole another thing which they associated string figures with. But perhaps one of the most telling comments that was made to me was that they're not that interesting because you can't buy and sell them. And to me, that wasn't about their monetary value so much as the fact that they didn't have a place within the ongoing economy, both in terms of actual economy, but also in terms of ideas and just what people did doing things. And so that they didn't have a place. And that was why they were no longer practiced as they had been in the past, because they didn't have a function. And so that was why I tried to find a way for them to live again to a certain extent, so that I could find out more about them, because otherwise it's very difficult to engage people in discussing something which they're not actually doing. So that was my roundabout answer to that question, was that the attitudes and responses were varied. Some people also felt that it was a reminder of cultural loss in that respect as well, because they weren't as well known as they had been. And there was an element, you know, like, why are you bringing this collection back now? You should have brought it back earlier when the old people were still with us, who could have told you more about them. And so there was also that sense of loss, which was communal as well as personal loss, because the women that I worked with largely were older women who were remembering something that they used to be very good at when they were younger. And so there was both a personal and a communal kind of sense of remembering and thinking about that past, but also rethinking it for the present.
That leads to a question which Kevin Murray would like to ask, which he addresses in general to the whole panel. So perhaps after Robyn is answered, anybody who would like to carry on with Kevin's point, please do. But Kevin begins by saying, as well as preserving artifacts such as string figures, to what extent can and should museums also revive and sustain the skills that were necessary to make those artifacts initially? What do you think, Robyn?
I don't know about should, but could. So all museum objects, so some of those musical instruments, for example, that Gru showed us, or even the clothing as well, they all speak about a practice that made them. And David's question to Howard about the work to be done, you know, there are so many collections in our museums of which we know so little about, and that are just begging for further research. But I think, and Lissant might be able to speak to this question also, about the idea that museums could also be places where skills are revived and documented. Lissant, perhaps you'd come in there.
Yeah, sure. In fact, I just wanted to mention that the British Museum hosts the Endangered Material Knowledge Program, which is a grant-giving program supporting the documentation of knowledge, endangered knowledge around objects internationally. And it's been going for 3 years. It's headed up by someone called Harry Ashley, who I think is in this audience, and might want to add a comment. But what that program does is enable us to document skills, skills, knowing, bodily understanding around objects, all different kinds of knowledge and from many different kind of places. The funders of that program, who are called Arcadia, are rather won't allow us to support revitalisation programs per se, but that's all right, because if you're documenting something, you're drawing people's attention to it, and documentation almost always leads to a form of revitalisation. So I feel very unfussed about that particular. I mean, I'm not as grieved about that as I might be, perhaps is the way of putting it. But so there are programs that are doing that, and it's just worth being aware of it. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And from the panel, I think, Gwyneira, you had your hand up first, and after that would be great.
Yes, so to follow on also from Lissant, and then thank you also to Howard for the wonderful introduction to Recovering Voices. So that's also the premise of Recovering Voices. And what I've found really interesting over the years is it's a community initiated and led application process. So communities decide on the materials that they want to work on, decide on the topics, which I think is really important, so that the Indigenous knowledge systems are kind of front and foremost in the way in which they're working and thinking about the collections. And part of the methodology is filming the conversations, and so it's very much about this kind of the object is a catalyst, but what we find is that people reconstruct what has become this kind of distributed and pulled apart world by the museum that has sort of categorized and, you know, made sort of siloed in disciplines, whether it's mineral sciences or birds and ethnology, this knowledge that needs to come back together again. So it's really become this process of reconstituting this sort of you know, worldview, the language, the expertise. We encourage intergenerational groups, so that there's also this process of making sure that younger generations are physically in the space during that conversation with the older experts, which was done specifically because, and this is to sort of think about the sort of post-repatriation methodology, that often funding, especially through the government, was only going to repatriation officers to visit collections. And then that was limiting the kind of access and the kind of conversations. And so we're kind of adding a second layer to that, to say it's really important to have the younger generations who've not had access to collections to be there, you know, physically with those objects, with the experts that have had access in the past. So it's a really, for us, it's and I like that idea of museum as process. It's just a huge learning process about the possibilities now available through these kinds of programs. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And then it'll be Gro then, and after Gro, it'll be Howard. So go.
All right. Thank you. No, my comment was along the same line. I actually wanted to speak to the drum, which is a shamanic drum. So it's a religious instrument, and we only have 3 left in Norway, because the Danish missionaries in the 18th century took them all to Denmark, and then they were kept somewhere where they burned. So we have and the Sami religion was always talked about as something that was lost because of the efforts of the missionaries. When I first came back to Norway, it was something of the past and something we knew very little about. But the story since then has changed dramatically, and these days Sami religion is something that is definitely living and developing. And our interpretation of the Sami religion, of course, also came from missionary records in the early days. And I also see that's changing quite dramatically. So, for example, the other drum that is current, we have not the one that I showed, but another one that is very famous and is currently also being repatriated from the Danish National Museum to Sami Museum in the north. And we had, for a long time, we had an idea of what the symbols meant on the drum. And recently someone said that, well, are you sure about this? Are you sure these are the right interpretations? Because this drum was taken during the Norwegian Inquisition, and the shaman who owned it was tortured. And the records we had of the interpretation of the symbols were out of the torture, the manuscripts that what was written down during the torture. So even that has changed again. So I mean, I think this is an illustration of how things, not just an object, but the description of it and what we think of it is continuously changing. And maybe the word revival is not always appropriate. It's hard to know.
I have a thought from what you've all just been saying that feeds back to David's original question and shifts it a little bit, because, and I think Lissant will hopefully see the reality, perhaps, behind what I'm saying, is that ethnographic museums, anthropology collections are actually beginning to take a much more significant place in museums. And one of the reasons that is because of the holism that anthropology has, because actually it doesn't separate material objects from relationships with people, but it also requires all the kind of investigations that science can use towards the identification of objects and all the help that we need for those kind of things. And suddenly people are seeing this as exciting and broadly applicable. And I think it's got something to do with what anthropology always has been, but also the fact that now anthropology is really involving engagement with community members and people with wide ranges of interests in the collections as a resource. So that was just a thought that came from what you've been saying there.
Well, thank you very much. Paul, Jason, would you like to say anything? Please do, if you would. Jason first? Okay, go on, you go first, Jason, whilst Paul's having a think.
Yep, sure. I was thinking about the role of museums in revitalisation efforts now. You know, I showed a slide there of recent work last week in a community, and I think this is a really great example. So that community were interested in reviving ceremonial traditions which are on the wane, and they have been contacting various museums across Australia for assistance in that process. And I have to say that the museums have all responded overwhelmingly with amazing offers of providing digital images, of providing physical access to collections when people visit, access to audio recordings, all sorts of things. So there's a great kind of, at least in the field that I'm working in, there's a great kind of feeling that museums are these reservoirs of really important information for communities today. And museums are deeply aware of their role or their potential role in the kind of reparative work that needs to go on within settler colonial environments like the one that I'm working in. So yeah, I think there is enormous potential there.
Thank you. And then Paul is next, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that notion of the collection as a reservoir is a really interesting one. And I suppose my own thinking is very much around, you know, the planetary crisis and what in the kind of decolonial literature has sometimes been called epistemicide, you know, this idea that epistemologies have been destroyed in the process of colonialism and so on, and that in some senses these collections represent traces of knowledge systems that may or may not survive themselves, but that notion of the possibility that they offer of somehow learning alternative ways of being that is a very broad lesson indeed that we need to learn in terms of thinking about the sustainability of you know, the planet and our lives on it. So I think that notion as a reservoir of knowledges that has more than just relevance for the communities associated with the collections themselves, but that we need to learn from in a much broader sense. I suppose the other thing is to connect skills in the present with those kind of past skills, you know, and to think about translating those into the contemporary world and systems, these different value systems, perhaps. I actually had a question relating to that, but I haven't got a way of entering question the thing, so I don't know. I just put that as a placeholder that I had a question relating to the digital, but I don't want to jump the queue, as it were. But I had a specific question for Gwyneira at some point, if
well, of course. Well, there is one connection. There is one further follow-up question from Joy Henry connected to this, I think, which we should run through, and then we'll ask yours. But before that, Lissant would like to make a comment.
Yeah, I just felt an obligation to my colleagues at the British Museum, especially in the Department of Oceania and the Americas, because I was talking about the Endangered Material Knowledge Program funders when I was talking about revitalisation, not about the department. And we engage with different communities in many different parts of the world and greatly value our engagement with those communities, and fully keen on whatever they want to do with the objects. I mean, there's no dictation. I just felt like because I talked about the Arcadia thing, I perhaps been a bit misleading. And also what Howard, what you just said about the importance, about the change in attitude to ethnographic collections is true even in the British Museum. I think there's a real revaluing of those collections and the importance of them for the institution that is totally a result of the engagement with communities. So that's correct comments.
Well, thank you very much. Now, good morning, Joy. Professor Henry has a related question, which I think is terribly relevant, and I'll read it out, and we can begin with Howard, perhaps, and then we can go around everybody. And she says, thank you for creating the book and for interesting presentations. When that is, of course, Joy Henry, when I worked with Indigenous peoples in various countries with the help of some of your authors, for which many thanks again, many of them talked of museums in very negative terms. Now, that was years ago now, so I wonder whether the changes you're describing have now also become reflected in the views of Indigenous peoples more generally. So I think that's clear, Howard, and let's begin with your good self.
I mean, that's a very difficult question for me to answer. It would have been good if Gilda Andrew, who's one of our Indigenous contributors, was able to come here, but she's actually taking her father on a visit to his country this very moment in time, so she couldn't be. So I think I would say there's been a really major change recently. I mean, for myself, working with Yolngu people, really for 50 years, people have been largely positive about museums. So I actually haven't had to encounter that. And I've written about this partly because there's been enormous continuity between the work of anthropologists from really quite early on in the colonial period in that area, which was really quite late. And so, you know, museums have always been, and collections, something that's been part of the colonial process in a very different way to that colonial process as it would have been in Victoria or Tasmania 200 years ago. So I can't generalize from that, but I also know that the engagement of museum collections now in just the way that the questioner Kevin Murray was pointing, has actually been very beneficial. People are suddenly seeing the enormous value of this material, and museums have now been really more focused on people's engagement with them in just the same way that Lissant has said. And I think there's always been a more positive attitude than that is often publicly asserted. And obviously we've seen in you know, Gwyneira and Gru's cases, well, everybody's case, the experiences of the moment. Yeah.
Thank you. Any colleagues around the table would like to, what about this question about how do Indigenous peoples react to yours? Oh, please, Gwyneira, and then Jason. Oh, sorry, and then Robyn. So anyway, so it's Gwyneira, Jason, and Robyn in order, please.
Yeah, I think that I think this is such an important question, because I think both can actually come together at the same time, both the positive and the traumatic, in the sense that, I mean, to give you examples with the Recovering Voices program, within the week of a visit, the beginning of the sort of entry point is often one of despair and grief about the fact that these objects have been, you know, or kin. Often people view the things as kin and as animated, that these have been removed, that they represent this sort of colonial violence. But towards the end of the week, the conversations are much, you know, more centered around this idea of bringing people back together with their heritage, and it's a very positive space. So I feel as though, you know, that both have to be reconciled, that you can't just have one or the other. And we just did a survey with all the communities that had participated with Recovering Voices in the last 10 years. And one of the things that we've written about with community members on this particular topic is this idea of bearing witness, the fact that people need to come into the museum and record these stories that are about the complexity, and that those go on the record. And I think that was one of the things that came up in a number of the discussions, that you know, that the documentation process is now also documentation about the view of the museum, or the view of the sort of the colonial history in the museum, and that then becomes part of the record. So we're you know, I feel like we're learning how to discuss and understand you know, both the sort of the positive and then the really difficult histories. So thank you.
Jason?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that from my experience, I feel as though perhaps in the last few decades, there's been an increasing number of Indigenous staff working in museums, certainly within Australia. And I think that has changed the relationship to some degree in terms of the way communities are now interacting with museums as these kind of reservoirs of knowledge. And certainly in the more recent work I've been doing, there's this great bridging work that's going on with younger and sometimes more senior Indigenous staff who are ensuring that the museum is engaging in the transformational work that it has always been involved in, but it will continue to engage in these, making changes that better reflect the needs of stakeholder and source communities. You know, things like changing the way objects are catalogued, introducing mapping technology so countries or objects are related to specific places to really bring them to life. All sorts of really interesting work that's probably has emerged in more recent times, and perhaps digitisation has had a part to play in this too, in increasing the accessibility of collections to a wider group of people.
Thank you. And Robyn's next, please.
Yeah, I was just going to comment similarly that museums, I don't think, were places which understood Indigenous or First Nations people as being part of their audience in the old days. And I think that is changing, and with that, different ways of presenting that material. And in my own personal experience, I've been working with a regional museum in Wagga, which is in the Riverina district of New South Wales, and they're working on a redevelopment in which the first gallery is going to be a Wiradjuri gallery, and it's going to tell specific Wiradjuri stories about that place, which is something completely new in that environment. But it's also, the museum as a whole is going to address the history of colonisation on that local level in a way that the regional museum hasn't up until now. So I just wanted to flag that as changes generally in the way that museums are now responding to their own brief as well, which is different.
Indeed, it's very thought-provoking. Yeah, and Gro, you're next in the line.
Yeah, just briefly, though, I think that's, I mean, I think that there is a lot of, in my experience, negative feelings towards museums as colonial institutions, as erasers of history. But at the same time, I think this is also like a sort of figure to think with. I mean, because there are so many of the same museums that are criticized are also engaging in a lot of like experimental activities. There's lots of digital programs, catalogs translated to Sami. There's collaborative museum exhibitions. There's traveling exhibitions. There's repatriation exhibitions, but there's also a great interest in amongst Sami academics and artists to challenge exhibition practices and to make them anew, as in the just after Easter, I'm going to Venice because this year there's a Sami pavilion at the Biennale, which of course is incredibly, it's made by the three curators there are all political activists in collaboration, they're Sami, in collaboration with three Sami artists. And this, to have this kind of field where things develop, I think, and also the fact that Sami themselves have very strong museum institutions, I think help to expand the understanding of what we can be too.
Thank you. I don't know, Lissant, whether you wanted to say anything about Indigenous. Not, okay. And in that case, we move to into Paul's question. The floor is yours, Paul.
Actually, conscious of time, I wondered whether we should stick to the question. I noticed there's a very interesting question touching on perhaps some of this from William Nitsky, who's posing a question about that issue of displaying the work of the museum rather than it happening behind scenes. I wonder whether that would be an interesting thing. And just linking to what Gro was saying there about, you know, participatory exhibition making as a way of, you know, actually doing this. You know, so thinking of actually this process as being part very much of what museums will also be displaying, but to do that very much in collaboration with communities, and indeed posing these questions in a very public way rather than in scholarly books and journals.
Sure. Well, look, I'll tell you what, Paul, then let me just read out his question so everybody's seen it, and then go ahead, because he addresses it to you anyway. And so what William is suggesting is that he'd like to ask a question as follows. When museums do conduct the often difficult and mutually rewarding work with communities, Paul Basu, in his introduction, emphasises that they can share the stories and developments in these processes and practices with its public, and not just conduct them behind the scenes. But practically and critically speaking, how do the contributors propose to do this? And how can museums show the public how they're grappling with the past and present and the challenges of redirecting our futures? And do the contributors have any practical examples that they can share? Well, Paul, do you want to begin, Paul, before we go around, because he mentions your comments? Anything you'd like to say about that?
Well, I think I already kind of said, I think that there's a great opportunity for actually bringing this into to museum spaces as exhibitions, but also to think more broadly, of course, about where the work of the exhibition is exhibited, as it were, that it's not necessarily restricted to the space of the you know, the museum. My virtual background here is of an exhibition at Cambridge at the moment at the Museum of Art and called Re-Entanglements, and I suppose to some degree that's what we've attempted to do there, rather than put a colonial collection on display, as it were, and make that the subject of the exhibition. What we've tried to do is to use that as a provocation to think about the status of this particular colonial collection, assembled in the context of you know, colonial anthropological surveys in West Africa. So it's a collaboration with various stakeholders coming from different positionalities, artists, cultural activists, and so on, which is specifically framing around the kinds of questions that I guess the book is addressing. So I think it makes for a very, I'm not meaning this exhibition in particular necessarily, but as a topic for exhibition, for engaging in these questions, it seems to me a very important thing that we should be doing to open up the complexity, because I think another tendency has been to exhibit merely guilt, and to focus on that only, rather than to open up that and see how, as someone said, you know, both the trauma and the positive possibilities can sit together in a kind of a critical space.
Yeah. There needs to be some from dialogue. I'm reminded of the exhibition about the making of Chattel Hugh that took place at SOAS. I thought that was a remarkably good exhibition. And it showed the way that academic knowledge or scientific knowledge, in this case about the site, was put together with an extraordinarily complex array of people behind the scenes. Absolutely. Well, I think Lissant first, and then Howard on the screen. So please, Lissant.
I just wanted to point out to some work that Howard and Gay Scarthorpe from the British Museum and Maria Nugent have edited as a book that was published last year. So, I mean, museums communicate through exhibitions, but they don't only communicate through exhibitions, they communicate through other means as well. Publications and also ideally websites. So I can't put my hand up there, but the, or not for the BM mainly. But that book does exactly engage with collections and how they can be reconnected to knowledge. This is a book called Ancestors, Empires. Howard will have to correct me on the title, which is about Aboriginal, Indigenous Australian collections in provincial museums in the UK mainly, and then reconnect what those objects were and what they meant when you bring information to them. So that exact connection process of reconnection led to that book. And I think I'm going to let Howard continue to talk about it, but it just, there are other ways to communicate in exhibitions, because well, it depends where you are. Museums, different museums can do different kinds of exhibitions. Not all museums are equal when it comes to exhibitions, that's for sure. Thanks.
Howard, please. Thank you.
Right, sorry, just unmuting myself. Yes, and I'm having a senior moment and not remembering any more about the full title of the book, but I'm sure I'll come up with it in a minute.
Museums, Infinity and the Culture of Protocol.
No, it's a different one. But look, I mean, I thought that was a very important question, and I think that Lissant has answered part of it by saying that there are many different ways in which the work of the museum is going to be revealed, and the potentiality of the museum is going to be revealed. And I think a lot of that is going to be through publications. I also think that it's really important. People have been talking about understanding museums and the point Paul was making as reservoirs of knowledge and so on. We need to understand that the importance of objects is not just their position in contemporary art context, that really museums have to be working with their collections, with communities, and actually this requires resources. I think museums are really oriented towards doing this, but where is the funding coming from? The whole way in which museums have been used in recent years as educational resources has just been simply as a place where you take children for an afternoon. So it's been sort of visitor oriented rather than collection engagement. And I think that that is fundamentally an important way. I was also going to say that I have been involved working with Yolngu in all sorts of exhibitions that have been Yolngu generated. So one of the opening exhibitions at the National Museum of Australia, the very opening exhibition, was on a Yingapunga sand sculpture. It was something that was suggested by Yolngu as being the most appropriate thing to do, because that particular sand sculpture, although it's associated with mortuary rituals and purification ceremonies afterwards, is one that is absolutely public, that is a ceremony that Yolngu see as being one that's very joyful, returning people to life and so on and so forth. And they were really engaged with that. And next year, no, this year in September, there's going to be an opening of an exhibition called Murdayan in America, which is curated by the Kluge-Ruhe and the Bukalong Mulka Art Center. That's an American university museum. And Yolngu have been really working on this the whole way through. So actually, some communities are very much seeing today museums as one of the ways in which they can be engaged in getting people to recognize the value of their way of life, their culture, their creativity, and so on and so forth. So I think there are lots of kind of things that we can do there, but I do think it's important to give resources to museums with collections so that they can be opened up. And the title of the book that is by Sculthorpe, Nugent and Morphy, and it's called Ancestors, Artifacts and Empire. And it's looking at collections in British and Irish museums, working with community members and collaboratively engaging with the material and in a sense being part of a dialogue between the museums in Britain and the communities in Australia. And so, I mean, I think this is going to be something very much that's part of the future, but it does require resourcing.
Well, thank you very much. So I think, Gro, you had your hand up, but if you put it down again,
Sorry, I was just conscious of the time. Like, I think we have about another 8 minutes, so I thought I would much rather listen to what other people say. Yeah, and I have to leave it at 12.
Oh no, we will stop promptly. That's absolutely fine. So we move along now to Gwyneira, please, and your comments.
Yeah, so we've really grappled with this in DC in terms of how do you bring these discussions to, to the front of house as opposed to just sort of back of house. So we've ended up really in the education department. I mean, that's the space that's taken us, and we do workshops. We had one a few years ago where Kelly Church, who's a basket maker from the Great Lakes, came, and she brought huge numbers of basket making kits. And members of the public sat with her and made baskets with her while she talked about the meaning behind them, as well as the concerns about emerald ash borers and the sort of extinction of trees in her region. And so we're really on this attempt to try and figure that out so that people, and this is kind of my philosophy about it, is that it really should be experiential. If you're trying to get that process from back of house to front of house, the beauty of what we do behind the scenes is that it's really immersive, and that you're part of conversations and experiences. And to how do you bring that to sort of the front of house is really difficult. So I'll just really quickly, again, sort of in because of the issue of time, give a shout out to the Zuni Museum in New Mexico, where they have a migration mural, and that's the first thing that you encounter, but there's always someone there to tell the stories. So you come in through the storytelling process, and then you can sort of find your way through some of the rest of the museum. But I think that there's some really great tribal museums that have found ways to bring that into kind of the museology practice itself, which I think is fantastic. So and yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And Jason, your hand is up.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I just wanted to make the point that a lot of the behind the scenes work that's done, for example, I've been involved in the development of online collections and heavily involving communities in the design of those collections and the shape of those collections. The community sees that work, and it leads to all sorts of great and interesting collaborations and engagements, but the public sees it less so. They're less drawn to that environment. So I just think we need to be aware that, communities are, they're aware of the behind the scenes work that goes on, but the wider public, we really need to find ways of telling those stories to a larger group of people.
Well, thank you. Well, it's obviously been a totally fascinating morning. Or evening. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I think we should leave the editors of the book to have the final word, and then we'll ask Haneen to close the session. So I don't know whether you'd like to go first. How would you, Robyn? Who would like to be the first?
Oh, let Robyn go first.
Right. Okay. So Robyn, then Howard, please.
Oh, microphone.
Mic on, Robyn.
Yes. Well, I'd just say, yes, that's an important point about bringing that work behind the scenes out to be seen. But also, I think I'd like to make a plea for all of these lost unknown and ill-fated collections that are so rich yet that we have in our museums. And again, it's though the resources and the human effort of exploring them that is required. To you, Howard.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say that suddenly I'm struck by something that we've all forgotten. It's really like taking for granted that we value the collections not in monetary terms. And Gwyneira really pointed this out by saying education is so important, but actually anthropology, museum anthropology, linguistics, archaeology, all of these disciplines are so important. And we actually need to bring those and get people to understand that they actually are bodies of knowledge that can be applied and then add value to collections. So we need to actually say that actually it doesn't sort of come by us happening to sort of look at objects and then say, ah, this is such and such, but you know, there's a discipline, there are a series of disciplines that have to work together to create that kind of thing. And I'd really like to thank Haneen and David and the RAI, really doing a fantastic job in putting this on. Thank you so much.
Yes, and to our contributors as well. Thank you for
absolutely.
To answering all of the requests that we have sent and the tasks that we have set.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely, it's your volume.
Well, it's been a delight to be with you. Please do join the RAI as a fellow if you're not one already, because we only exist because of our community. Of course, that goes without saying. And, you know, do come and become a part of it. Well, there we are. So that's enough from me. And I'll turn over to Haneen and say I wish you all a very, very nice day. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'm just left to say thank you as well to all of our panelists who presented today. That was really fascinating. And thank you to our audience for coming this morning or evening. And we hope you have a nice rest of your day or a pleasant evening, and hope to see you again at another event. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.